Nightreign is a weird game. Not only is it a real attempt at a combat competitive style of roguelike from FromSoft, it's also their first attempt at what feels like modern multiplayer. And for anybody that's a FromSoft veteran, you're aware of how foreign this must feel. And to be honest with you, I want to discuss not just the things that this game does really, really well, but some things that it desperately needs to do well moving forward if it continues to want to be relevant within the gaming sphere. My name is Spilo. I've put in around 70 hours on Elden Ring Nightreign, including beating all the bosses at least several times. And I want to talk today about what I would like to see from this game moving forward. Let's get into it. First off, who is this review for? Well, this review is primarily to give feedback about what I like about the game and what I'd like to see more of from the game, but it's also for people who are considering buying the game, and maybe people who have already played it and are trying to find words to put to how they feel. I'm going to be giving my feedback based off of what this game tried to be, not just trying to shift it towards something that I would want it to be. And I think that's going to be crucial because it's really easy to talk about why and where it fails to be at as a roguelike when in comparison to much better roguelike games, but I don't want to do that exactly. To really clarify and to give maybe some context about what I think this game is trying to be, I want to go back to something that I found linked on Reddit, which is an article with Miyazaki talking about taking risks, giving opportunities to developers, and much more. He says, budget, scale, scope, everything has grown to a point where room for failure is not tolerated as much as I think it was in the past, he told me. From Software has its own way of hedging risks, so to speak, and that most of our projects have a partner who is financing the project. From a business management perspective, we're not betting everything on any one single project. At the same time, you have to find the right project to allow for failure, whether it's smaller in scope or scale, or it's a small module within something bigger. There needs to be room for that. I think that's where a lot of young game directors will be challenged and will be able to learn from. Making sure you understand and identify where pockets of failure can be allowed is how we try to grow our talent. And I really appreciate that take from Miyazaki. I think it's something that's desperately underrated within the gaming sphere today. As somebody that's done a lot of coaching and leadership in my life, I think the opportunity to make failure an experiment is unbelievably crucial for long-term success. And it feels a little bit like Nightreign may be FromSoft doing just that, not just within the roguelike, but expanding more into the class identity and more experimentation with multiplayer. I hope this experiment gives them information not just on how to make this current game better, but to make future projects more successful. I really do feel like this is an attempt at making something that is more focused on multiplayer and more competitively honest, more dynamic, more combat focused, and less focused on just the boss fight and the opaque storylines. I don't want to get too sucked into how to optimize this as a roguelike because it may not just be something that really fits with what FromSoft intends the game to be. Finally, before I get into the actual review, this is going to be my last warning. My opinion will definitely bias you if you haven't played this game before. I might even bring up issues that otherwise you wouldn't have noticed or otherwise wouldn't have bothered you, so make sure to play your game before you watch this review and make your own decision first. So final recommendation here. If you enjoy FromSoft games and have a friend or two to play with, I highly recommend Elden Ring Nightreign. It is a very unique experience as a multiplayer game, although I don't necessarily recommend the DLC, the extra stuff, the bonus deluxe version without knowing exactly how this game is going to be developed or what the DLC looks like. On the opposite side of the spectrum, if you are a more roguelike fan, not a FromSoft fan particularly, or will be playing this game exclusively solo, I cannot recommend it currently for its price, but that may change depending on the development moving forward, not just the content releases, but also how the game matures. I just don't think it's necessarily worth it, and you're probably going to be able to find games that scratch that itch elsewhere. Before we get into the negatives, I'd like to talk about the positives here, and not just because I'm trying to be a nice guy here, but because I legitimately think that before we even talk about what needs to be done better, we need to talk about what's done well so that we can accentuate those things moving forward. The positives, I think FromSoft's expansion into the class system and cleaning up their combat was very successful. There are many unique classes with some really neat playstyle variations with an excellent vision of class design. Sometimes the execution isn't perfect, we'll talk about that one later, but the idea, the concept of behind what these classes are supposed to do, what they look like, and how they're supposed to behave is not only really unique, but also just really darn cool. The combat side of things with the sprints, the combat balance, the wall jump, and all those other things that Elden Ring base doesn't have are definitely going to spoil you and make you not really want to go back and do combat in base Elden Ring as much. Obviously, there's still a long way to go. FromSoft still is just terrible when it comes to balancing and design and some of those things, but honestly, it shows a more combat focus that was a really refreshing breath of fresh air for somebody that's been a big critic of some of the original game's balance. Boss visual design and soundtracks are great. Some bosses also really stand out combat-wise. They're almost universally really, really cool experiences. And the little story moments that are a part of the game are light, but relatively nice. The personalities of each character are given a little bit of space to express themselves. There's some sick cutscenes, and it's also a lot less opaque. Like, you can actually kind of follow what's going on, which is nice. And finally, the multiplayer playing with friends experience is great. I want to shout out to my friends Caleb, Stefano, and Tectris, who who I really loved playing with. Honestly, was one of the best gaming experiences that I've ever had, and the pressure of the whole roguelike side of it definitely made for some really hype moments, something I'm just not really used to in FromSoft. So now to the criticisms, and based off of those strengths, I really want to highlight potential is the key word here. I don't just want to criticize, I want to give feedback about what I think they could be doing better, leaning into those strengths. There are so many things to work with here. Elden Ring is beautiful. Visuals, class design is a strength, and a much more improved multiplayer experience is a foundation that these guys need to be building off of. Now, for categories, we're going to be breaking things down into a couple of them. Onboarding/communication, class design, the relic system execution, map/variety, bosses, and quality of life. And we'll specifically focus on feedback when and where I have an idea, just plain criticism when I don't. And there will likely be a few that maybe I misunderstood or maybe you guys disagree on. These are just general impressions after the hours that I've put in. First off, communication and onboarding. I don't think the class basics are communicated as well as they ought to be. The tutorial is decent to get into, but it really expects you to be familiar with the Elden Ring system to play Nightreign effectively. And I would really think that they would benefit from a brief combat tutorial for each class, just the fundamentals of what the characters do, not just the text, but how do the abilities actually work. The Revenant example is, when do I pull out which character? What are the strengths and weaknesses of which one of them? Which one does more DPS? Which one doesn't? The fact that the ultimate makes your summon also use an ultimate. The fact that you can two-hand your claws. There's just like a lot of things that we assume that you're going to figure out because we're all Elden Ring veterans and we know to experiment with these things. We know to use the wiki, we know to use YouTube, we know to use Reddit, we know to take notes. But for the average player, a large portion of players, there's just probably going to be too much all at once, and there's going to be a lot that's either just completely missed or a lot of frustration because those concepts aren't explained well. I know that this is classic FromSoft, and I don't expect them to ever have a really good onboarding system, but I think if you're trying to expand into a more multiplayer, more general experience for the player base, then this needs to be a huge priority. I also think that the tools that they give you, like the visual codex, are not emphasized enough. Knowing your class's scaling is really useful information, but honestly, I would like to be forced to use the visual codex in the tutorial so that I'm actually reminded that it's there. There's also a couple of changes in the weapon stats and skills that aren't communicated. There's also some weapon goofiness about what weapons are what type, like the claws from the Revenant aren't claws, they're fists, and there's certain swords that aren't the same type that their title says. If the game is going to be more serious about combat, it needs to be serious about combat. And finally, for the onboarding, I do think the roguelike experience of learning or experimenting on your first couple of drops can be very overwhelming, but I don't necessarily think this is a bad thing. I just think that there's a tricky balance of introducing a lot of exploration without overwhelming the player. Oftentimes, a lot of roguelikes just kind of throw a lot at you at the start, but I don't think that necessarily needs to change. I think if we're going to feel overwhelmed about the map, that's probably the best thing to feel overwhelmed about, because it's always something that you can learn more about the more that you play. Moving on to class design here, and this is going to be a pretty expansive discussion point because it is such a strength of this game. What made me want to play this game more was different class experiences and different builds. Not just different characters, but how different characters could function differently with relics. We'll talk more about those in a little bit. The map and boss repetition can get a little bit tedious, even with the shifting earth events. So I really think that this game, for the biggest bang for the buck, should lean more into class playstyle variety and or cleaning up the basics of what the characters give. Make sure that every passive is thoughtful and useful. Make sure every skill is thoughtful and useful. Make sure that every ult is thoughtful and useful. And while the initial class fantasy and initial design has vision, it's just not always executed very well. I played a lot of different classes. We're going to focus on the one I put more time onto, one of those being Revenant, where the summons just scale terribly. They fall off significantly in higher ranks, and this isn't just a power complaint, because I can understand that you have to be careful to not overtune certain things because then it gets too easy. But when my summons just don't feel all that useful at night bosses and later on in the game, it takes away a fundamental part of the game, which is making different choices and using my kit. The fact that I don't have any FP restoration on my character seems like a massive oversight. And then moving on to the Executor, you have an entire fundamental of the design, why people want to play him, being the parry mechanic, that just doesn't really function very well in multiplayer. It's very hard to hold aggro even if you have the right relics. Executor's passive also feels niche or a very weird setup with seppuku to make it work, so it just feels like a wasted resource. And then to compensate in all the wrong ways, he has way too high stats in arcane and dex. It basically means that he's just a status effect bot, and that even makes it bad versus certain bosses that are immune to statuses. Feels a bit of a one-trick pony with wasted opportunity with other aspects of his kit. And finally, Duchess, there's too much of her relics and focus put into stealth, which is not as useful in this game, and even her ultimate feels a bit of a one-trick pony, where it's pretty much just exclusively used defensively or to pop off a res and doesn't have as much offensive potential as you might think it has. I'm not saying that all of my points are 100% correct, but there's enough truth in each of these points to question whether they're designed or balanced as well as they ought to be. Optimally good class design opens up different playstyle differences without compromising the strengths and weaknesses of each character. And I think that while the initial vision of what the characters are intended to do is there, the actual execution is very lacking. I think in general, the balance is also something to look at with team versus solo. Obviously, Iron Eye absolutely dominates, and there's other characters that don't do as well. well, but I'm not as concerned about the actual strength or balance of things because it's not a PvP game, so it's maybe okay to have some characters be stronger than others. Now I want to take this moment to transition from the class design into relics, because this is a very key juncture point between these two things, because I think a great deal of the variety with how classes function isn't just due to the balance of their abilities and their passives, but also the balance and creation of the relics. There's a huge lack of variety of class builds and really poor relic design for the class specific stuff. There's just not enough playstyle variation when in conjunction with class design. There should be playstyle choices and heavy experimentation for each class through those relics. An example where this is done well is with the Wilder, where you have 2 grapples, or grapple with a follow-up, or your ultimate provides fire in the floor, and there's actually some choice about which one you want to choose, although I do think there could be probably more for Wilder. But then there's stuff like Revenant, where there just isn't a whole lot there. Ghost Flame on your ult is fairly useful. Giving a different perk based off of your summon to have out is fairly useful, but there just isn't a lot of playstyle variation. They either make the character just stronger at what they already do without really adding any new variety or any new choice, or they're just not all that useful. I've got a lot of ideas for relics here. Revenant could have a relic that adds a ranged attack on some of her summons. Maybe adds more HP and tankiness for her summons so they scale better in the game. Maybe a relic where you could change the stat of your character by a letter or two. Maybe go down in dex, but go up in strength. Maybe change your starting skill and your starting weapon to something that's more consistent that isn't a status application. Summons for Revenant could give teammates buffs at the expense of their HP. Make it more summons are more likely to pull aggro. Your ultimate gives a self-damage buff. For the Executor, you could scale your parry posture damage up, but scale the damage of the weapon down. Guarding is more likely to pull aggro. Building your charge curse sword gives you 2 holy dashes instead of 1, but parry now does less posture damage. Your ultimate roar used on teammates actually buffs their damage output or their resistances. And instead of your useless passive, your passive actually gives you HP restoration when there is a status proc near you. Just a small amount of HP. There's so much class variety and tools to explore with that are just completely undercooked when it comes to the relics. I would say there needs to be at least twice as many class relics, maybe even another relic slot, and to scale the difficulty of the game accordingly. You see, the goal here is I'm not trying to say that we need to make each character stronger, but that each character needs more ways to express what you want to experiment with. If Revenant had twice as many relics to experiment with, I would have played Revenant for probably twice as long, and the same goes for every single class that I experimented with. When it comes to replayability, it's really easy to say more maps and more bosses, and while of course I agree, I think the biggest bang for your buck is just to use the tools that we already have in the game, and specifically the things that Nightreign does really well already. Moving on to that, to more in-depth relic stuff, I just think in general this game desperately needs a relic crafting system. I think the concept that we need to understand here is that progression and secondary rewards other than finishing the boss encourages experimentation and allows for patience. If I fail on a boss run but I get more merc or more relics to play with, then I'm not so sad about the loss and I'm more willing to try again and experiment more. As it is right now, you really only feel good if you beat the boss, and oftentimes the rewards still suck. And I think the key thing is that you need to be able to utilize merc, even if it's extremely expensive, to purchase a passive to be able to craft relics, so that you're able to build a relic that has 3 passives that you want, even if it costs you 15, 20, 25, even 30k merc to get to that point. The rewards are just totally RNG, and it feels oftentimes mathematically nearly impossible to work for the perfect relic. It really discourages grinding, and it really discourages build variety and creativity because there's just hopeless to get the perfect relic for the perfect situation. And I think allowing for people to grind and craft and try different builds because they can actually work towards those experimental builds would be a huge buff to the replayability and the quality of life of this game. I don't have a problem with some RNG. It creates some thoughts and excitement for when you do get the relic that you want, but at a certain point it just becomes mathematically impossible for that to actually happen consistently, and there's no other alternative. The relic system has potential, but it desperately needs to be reworked in how it functions. One more tiny little detail for the relics is that I think many of the relic balance is just terrible. The more I've been studying up on the relics recently, the more I found out that a lot of like the +1 attack ones are literally giving +1 attack, and even some of the stat bonuses give such minuscule bonuses that they don't even feel worth slotting. I think the relics by intention are supposed to be relatively small bonuses, which I think is cool, but when there's only 3 of them, it definitely feels like there's not a lot of variance in playstyle, especially when you're basically encouraged to only use the class-based relics or the more macro ones like Stone Sword Keys. I think if they want to encourage variety in builds, they need to make these relic bonuses much more effective than they already are. And just the general ease of use of these relics in terms of slotting them in, the different colors can also be a nightmare as well, but we won't go down that rabbit hole. Transitioning from relics here, I think that class builds wouldn't feel so forced with certain bosses if there were more variety with the class builds and with the relics. More ways to outsmart the boss mechanics using your ultimate in a different manner would feel really cool, using your cooldowns in a different manner, different summons, different weapons, if the relics provided that build variety. And I think the boss design combat can be a bit of a mixed bag because of that. If you don't have the the right characters for the right bosses, it's not that you're totally useless, it can just feel like a not so great experience. Augur is a great example where you have a water boss where you can do some chip damage on some of his summons, but oftentimes it kind of feels like you have to have some form of lightning, if the map even gives that to you, or you need to play some form of rain damage. A lot of them function really well with multiple players, some don't do so well with solo, that's kind of a separate issue, but some don't. Oftentimes it can just be a generic big beast and that's about it. I really like Libra. Moth Beetle combo is visually really unique, but sometimes it's just a slab of meat with a couple of mechanics slapped on. I will say though that in general, while I'm being critical of the bosses, I do think they're a strength of the game, and I am impressed with the amount of creativity they've put into it. Just think it could be a little bit better in certain aspects. I think the boss weaknesses, for example, could be a little bit too pronounced, where they are basically auto win or auto lose depending on the situation. You don't have the opportunity to exploit this weakness if you get unlucky with your map. Maybe a little bit too swingy. You want to encourage people to actually exploit the weaknesses without making it that you have to use the weakness, otherwise the boss fight is twice as hard. It's a tricky line to toe. And finally, boss design can involve a little bit too much running for some classes. Also, some of the sprint stuff, we'll talk about that a little bit, that doesn't help either. Boss rewards can feel really RNG, and I'm not just talking about the final bosses here. Sometimes the rewards that you get from any boss on the field can just feel too weak or too useless, or sometimes just completely inappropriate. I think there needs to be a fourth option here where you can choose a small amount of runes, 5, 10, 15, 20, depending on whether it's a blue, purple, or gold drop, so that way you're having a bit of a seatbelt to avoid worst case scenario. I think it's good to have bad runs and good to have good runs. You want variance, you don't want things to be solved right off the bat, and I think the rune option should always be worse if there's a better choice available, but I think you want to prevent the worst case scenario, where somebody has an actively unfun, super negative RNG experience that would turn them off from the game. The rune choice, again, should be the worst option and would be a bad run, but at least it's not unplayable. I think in general, the RNG in this game needs to have a bit of a safety catch to prevent those worst case scenarios without removing bad from the game entirely. You don't want to compromise the RNG completely because that's what makes each run unique. One additional idea for bosses, just for the variety of different maps, is to have maybe a random highlighted boss or camp type on the map besides the boss weakness that gives you bonus or just different rewards. Very similar to how certain camps can have the tornado effect where you have essentially invaders to deal with. Having an additional effect like that on the map that's just focused on different boss difficulty or different boss rewards would add, I think, more replayability than there already is. Speaking off of that unique variety, I think the maps in this game have a lot of work to do. I think the map variety could definitely be upgraded. Definitely the lowest hanging fruit is lean into the shifting earth more. There appears to be a bug to where you don't get the shifting earth after you've completed the game. I very rarely get it anymore, and that is absolutely a massive oversight because just the shifting earth tools that we already have provide a lot of value, and we need to be using this way more. In addition to that, also the random events like Margit showing up, the Madness Tower, these things almost never happen for me. In fact, I just had the Madness Tower last night, 70 hours in for the first time, and I still haven't seen the Walking Mausoleum. There could be a way to incorporate maybe like a daily or weekly boss reward, so you're motivated to fight certain bosses on certain days to kind of force that variety. Maybe something in the cosmetics department for rewards or just more merc. I assume they're also going to be incorporating more mob boss designs from the old games because there's some huge opportunities here. Even just seeing something like from the Sekiro, like Guardian Ape would be hilarious. And again, the more bosses and mobs that they add, the less likely we'll see the older bosses that we've already seen, which means that seeing them again wouldn't be too bad because it's been a while. So the more they add, the better it gets. I also feel that there's a bit of an unintuitive implementation of some of the exploration in this game. I don't think it's too bad most of the time. I think there's just enough exploration to reward it without feeling like you don't want to explore because you don't have time to, with a couple of exceptions. The lava pit, for example, feels really well designed because you're kind of forced to explore it with the way the circle closes, and it doesn't take too long to figure out once you've done it a few times, and it feels really rewarding to figure it out for the first time. But some things like the puzzle towers, for example, don't feel all that great, where there's some really unique things like, for example, I think you have to look and find one seal that's in a reflection of the water puddle. It's just a really cool artistic expression that is just completely wasted on a roguelike because you're running around and you don't have time to like. I guarantee you 95% of people have just pulled up a Reddit post to figure out how to solve those things, and it just seems like such a waste of a mechanic. I also think it's really underrated, the placement of these shifting earth events and just the locations of these events in general, whether it's Margit or the Madness Tower. Sometimes they can be spawned outside of the map, which is really stupid, but I think the biggest one that we don't see talked about a lot is why the lava pit feels so good is because it's perfectly placed in the middle of the map. So no matter where you are, northeast, northwest, southeast, southwest, you're able to quickly get to the middle of the map and then quickly do that, and then also the circle closes around that location. Night City is the complete opposite, where yes, the circle closes in that general direction, but the end goal of the Night City is on the very edge with the Wing of Estelle, who's incredibly difficult to fight. In addition to that, it's also on the very southwest of the map, so if you're not already there, you kind of have to go there directly. Now, you could say that that kind of forces run variety, where if it was always in the middle, then it'd just be kind of boring to play. But then I think they need to adjust where the boss placement is so that you're actually able to go for that boss. As it feels, the Night City is probably the most most interesting Shifting Earth event in terms of exploration, but also the least explored because of how little time or opportunity you have to actually do that. It's a tricky balance here between making something be explorable without making it so incredibly easy that people end up doing the same rotation over and over again. And finally, for the map, I do think certain shifting event rewards are not super well balanced. I think the lava pit's probably the best one, not just because legendary weapons are very useful, but also because the farm of runes is just incredibly good. There's so many small bosses that you can get along the way and can do so very efficiently. When in contrast, like the Winter Mountain, where there are a decent number of bosses you can farm along the way, but then there's a dragon communion reward, which doesn't always feel useful, and then you need to pass the ice dragon and you get the reward at the top, which only gives you more frostbite resistance and a frostbite damage buff, which is mostly only useful versus one night boss, and the dragon boss, who's so incredibly hard to fight, takes forever and is generally not worth it, and so you often just end up skipping the event entirely. There's just little things like that make it feel that certain Shifting of Earth events just are not balanced in terms of the rewards or have the difficulty of completing them, and I think it's something they need to look into. Editing this in later, worth pointing out that actually Shifting Earth is technically back here with the new Baron update. You can spend some of the points that you get from the Baron to actually reactivate certain Shifting Earths, which is awesome. So I guess technically this has been answered, but depending upon the availability of how often these things happen, my point is still there. So I'm glad that we have a solution now. Let's make sure that something like this solution stays moving forward. Finally, let's talk about quality of life, and these are going to be kind of broken up a little bit into different categories. I think smithing stones need a separate slot. I don't see why they should be taking up a gear slot. I don't like the fact that I have to confirm to pick up certain items even when I have open slots in my bag available. I don't know why that happens sometimes. I would love to have a sell relics screen on acquire, so at the end of a round you can sell your relics before you go back in, before they get lost. And also when you buy relics from the jar, you can again sell them right away. Just so much more efficient, so much easier. In terms of combat, I think the target lock in this game feels weird. I don't know if it's just me, but I swear compared to Sekiro and base Elden Ring, it's so much harder to swap targets. I don't like, especially with some of the boss designs, the fact that consuming a big burst of stamina when you start sprinting, it just doesn't seem super well balanced considering how much running you have to do. Doing things is fun, and while the stamina system is balanced so that you don't do things endlessly, the fact that I might run around the boss room and only have enough stamina for one hit before I have to dodge again just feels really bad. And then off of that, spell scaling is still pretty bad. Some spells are just infinitely better than others or cost way too much FP for the damage output. It's a lot better than Elden Ring, and I want to provide some positive reinforcement here. They've done a pretty good job of scaling a lot of really bad weapons and bad spells compared from Elden Ring, which to be honest with you had horrible balancing. I'm convinced that they don't even have somebody doing any of it, but it's still a work in progress for Nightreign, and I'd love to see them continue to work on that more. Finally, in terms of quality of life with map stuff, a couple of these I've already mentioned. Maps need to have a guarantee of at least one camp or one ruins for the boss's weakness. Again, having the difference between 1 and 4, maybe introduce some RNG in there. Maybe you're overstacked for the boss, maybe you undercook, but you at least have the opportunity to make a good choice. Sometimes there's just literally nothing, which just again seems a little bit too RNG for my tastes. As mentioned before, certain events spawn in the wrong location outside the death circle. That just feels like an oversight. Scaling of certain bosses like the ball-bearing hunter, or bell-bearing hunter, whatever. The butt-bearing hunter is just ridiculous. This guy is not even the hardest fight in the history of the world in terms of mechanics. He just has a ridiculous amount of HP and poise to the point where he actually has significantly more poise than I think any Nightreign final boss. Like you can use several ults in this guy and he doesn't even flinch. It's ridiculous. And there's obviously like gargoyles, dragons, things like that are obnoxious to fight because they just feel out of scale with the rest of the bosses. I have found legendary rewards can be inconsistent in terms of value. I oftentimes find that legendary weapons just aren't applicable for me, so a lot of times the purple drops are better than gold. I don't know if it's just bad luck on my end. I assume the remembrance queues are gone, right? So that we're not splitting up queue times too much, because obviously like that's a big no-no. You don't want to be splitting up your queues way too much in a multiplayer queue game. I think that's already handled. And obviously, as mentioned earlier, it's really frustrating that Shifting Earth is locked away once you finish the game for the most part. Like also I've heard that if you rest in the bed, you don't get it back again. So there seems like major oversights with the most playstyle variety that the game has to offer in terms of maps. This seems like a big oversight. And that about wraps it up. So in conclusion, I've got a lot of hours in this game. And to be honest with you, it was carried by the quality of the game, yes, but more often carried by the fun I had with the group and the fun of the different classes. So if the classes weren't fun, or if I didn't have a fun group, this review probably would have been a lot more negative. Nightreign really needs to emphasize the inherent strengths that it started with a clear vision towards what separates it from other FromSoft games and from other roguelikes. At the same time, it also needs to improve its weak points, not necessarily to make itself like other games, but to make it so that those pain points aren't quite as sharp. It doesn't really need to compete with top tier roguelikes to succeed. It just needs to be the best version of what it has to offer right now. Anyways, that's my opinion. Let me know what you guys think in the comments, and I'll see you next video.